We'll give it 1 or 2 more minutes. I see people are popping on. I believe on your screen there's a place to put questions, so feel free anytime to enter a question. I'll try to get to it. So I'm going to get started here. People can join. Thanks for taking time out of your day to listen in on this international retail and how to explore that. So hopefully this is good information for you. So I'm going to jump to slides. This is just a little bit about our company. Of course, you can always go to our website and read every page, as everybody always does. We're all over the globe, so we've got a lot of experience. We're in about 50 different countries that we've worked in. So we've done a lot of international work. So I wanted to share today some of our experience on U.S. companies, exploring these international markets. So I'm going to kind of go through today sort of this step-by-step process, the research, the different options, some of the challenges, and managing the business development costs, because it can be daunting. So it's really designed for retail marketers, but it's a similar process whether you're a broker, a tech company, or service provider, etc. Not that different. So let's start with step-by-step. We often see somebody very senior needs to own this. That's really the first step. Then we need to see, companies need to see that there's actually buy-in, that this is realistic. And there's stage gates we're going to get to later that you can explore it before you just have to decide that. But the steps are, we're going to go through each one of these, the research your markets, narrow your options, etc. At some point in that process, you actually go to the country and meet people, regulators, etc. And what are your strategies, approaches? The key really element here is pro forma and business case and a launch plan. And at some point, how much is it going to cost? How much are we investing to go and do this? So the key questions that we see a lot of companies call us and say, look, we're interested, say, okay, do you have buy-in? Usually it's, yeah, sort of, we're kind of looking at it. So one of the first steps we suggest is prepare an internal memo with some kind of budget, even just to explore this. So, here's what it's going to take for timing, what are the stages, feel free to use this PowerPoint, as much as you want. So is it realistic? So do you have the bandwidth? We often see this is something people are playing around with, but there's not. It's kind of done in spare time. And I don't really know anybody in our industry that's got tons of spare time. So it either is a focus or it isn't. And do you have the funding? Because even to do, do basic Google search and so forth, that doesn't really cost much. But at some point, there's a budget, even before you get to a yes or no on a go or no go. So there's more budget if you hire external help or buy research, etc. And if for a retailer, whether you buy or you build and you go to a new country, it's a minimum of $3 million, can be significantly north of that depending on your strategy. So, do you have that, or can you get that? Because if not, there's different ways to look at that. And a common mistake on the international market, if most people we know looking at this are pretty smart people, but if they don't have any international experience, it's classic. What you don't know costs money, and the mistakes. So the first step, of course, is research. So there's either do it yourself or go out and buy some. So one of the big tips we run into, everybody goes and Googles, to find what you can find. So when you Google from the US, you're using the .com Google URL and search. So you get what other countries or other regulators and so forth have thought enough to have posted and be searched by the .com. But if you go to the URL in the country, like .jp or .uk or whatever, you get a completely different view of what's available. So that's one of the tips. And in some countries, and I'll pick Japan in particular, what they post in English is extremely limited versus what they post in their native language. We find that in Italy, we find that in Poland. So you have to look at that as how much can I get in English, especially if you're only using Google. Everybody does a certain amount of do-it-yourself. You learn more, you save some money if you don't count hours. It takes a lot of time and effort to do that. Buying research tools saves a lot of time, of course, faster and easier, does cost money. Of course, we're pitching our international report, but there's others who sell research. There's a lot of research out there you can get. So one of the first things we talk to people about is develop a scorecard of, give or take, 15 items of what it is that you want, margins, market size, competition level, what are the requirements. So you start with a scorecard before you even start researching. So you kind of fill in based on the scorecard, what's the data I need or information I need for each of these sectors so that you can actually start to assess in kind of a logical path. And in some pieces have more than others. So we typically use a scorecard with a ranking. For example, margins is probably a lot more important than licensing requirements, as an example, or switch levels. We have switch statistics on most of these countries. If there's a country where 90+% is already switched, it's probably not as attractive as countries with 10 or 15% switched. So there's 16 potential retail markets. There's a list you can see here. There's a couple others like Poland and Brazil. The hot ones people are all interested in tend to be UK, Japan, Ireland's kind of a new market but smaller. Germany's a pretty big market. The Nordics, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark. While it's mature, they're pretty good markets. So Mexico, but it's limited, if you will, primarily to large C&I. If you're a mass market retailer or focused, not much to do in Mexico. Excuse me. So then we do the deeper research, and we start this by creating a list of elements needed for a business case. So that, again, your deeper research, once you've done your preliminary research, to kind of narrow your focus. So now you've picked one, maybe two markets you want to go deeper on. So we look at that as what do you need to create a business case in the pro forma, the financial models, if you will, and use that to act as your research guide. So here's some examples of information: retail market rules, the wholesale supply method, headroom analysis. Headroom is a big key, of course. What are the costs, for whether that's, once you sort out the billing, for example, do you need the print, or is that utility like Northeast POR markets? Not many of those out there. If you're going to outsource call center, which most people do to start, what are those costs? What are those metrics? What are the startup costs to launch? Whether that's legal, licensing, office space, the initial employees. If you're doing a startup, what's the personnel cost? What's the organization structure look like? When do you add bodies? Always assumptions around customer acquisition costs are key, whether that's sales channels or direct or door-to-door or whatever method. So at this point, when you've gotten enough of this deeper research, we recommend going and spending time in your target country. Visit the vendors, regulators, retailers, etc. So one of the common mistakes we see when companies go to a new country, they're asking vendors for quotes and prices because they need it for their business case and pro forma. But it's really hard to get that from most countries because they want to know that you're actually going to be there, as opposed to I'm just researching. So often the quotes you get, if you even get any, are at best indicative, but they don't get too serious about it. So we've got a lot of that data we've done. And if you're going to a country, we've seen kind of two models. You set up appointments and you go and you meet who you can meet. We believe it really helps to have somebody in country setting this up and going with you, especially if nothing else. Sometimes it's for the language, but mostly it's for the cultural. Having been in many international meetings, what they tell you and how they present is very different than the American style of doing business. So having somebody help you through that process, and most importantly, after each meeting, assess what you learned, or even prior to each meeting, prepare for, here's what this company or this, vendor or regulator, create a little presentation going in, a little bit about yourself, but more importantly, what are your plans? You're planning to come, here's what you kind of need. So they get a sense that, you're not just there to visit, you're there to figure out your business. And after each meeting, we do a download. Okay, what did we learn? And a key mistake a lot of American companies have made is, so they've left the country, the follow-up is critical. Whether that's an email or a letter, or something thanking them for the meeting. That's a common mistake we see that doesn't happen. Or sending your in-country person back out a week or two later just to visit, because you probably didn't get the pricing or quote you wanted. Somebody's got to follow up and get that for you. It's hard to do from here, especially if there's a language barrier. So now you've got your deeper research. You start looking at your strategic options. Should I buy something? There's companies like Shell's that they have a license and probably a legal entity, but no real, no customers. It's kind of ready to start. Or you buy a small retailer with, maybe 5,000-10,000 customers or something. Or depending on your strategy, you want to buy one of the top 10 to get started. So that's a different kind of set of pro formas and business plan. It's a different approach, because if you're going to go buy something, it's different than build. So the build is the startup, licensing, etc. So our suggestion is, regardless of what you do, go through the pro forma and business case for a startup, because you'll have a lot better understanding of all the costs and all the metrics. So even if you're going to go buy something, using your own internal build pro forma and business case, you'll have a better sense of whether that's useful for due diligence or simply to benchmark, cost versus time. So for example, if it takes 6, 8, 10 months to do a startup, what's the time value of buying that versus doing that versus a small retailer? If you even buy a small or a large retailer, it's typically at least a 4 to 6 month process between finding one, term sheets, due diligence, closing it out. So it's worth doing one to see what the other's worth. Another option is just be an investor. We see some of that in some countries, or form a joint venture, with 2 companies or maybe 3. More than that gets difficult. Or another strategy we've seen is they find a company in a country that has a large customer base, but they're not in electricity or gas. So you form a joint venture with them to get at their customers as a quicker way maybe to do customer acquisition than organic, whether that's other channels, door-to-door telemarketing, the usual prospects. So now you've got your basic data and you've got your deeper research. Now it's time for your business case and pro forma. So our tip is to build an interactive spreadsheet based on the assumptions tab, which is very detailed. And the way we build ours is you can change all the various assumptions or any given one and run multiple scenarios to see what the impact of, maybe it's a higher customer acquisition costs or a commission percentage or, different ramp rate for customer acquisition based on different scenarios, so forth. We find doing the pro forma will drive the business case. We typically run at least 3 scenarios, and typically, oftentimes, a dozen or more based on sensitivities. So I put in here the tabs in our spreadsheet, cost assumptions, SG&A. We go pull load curves by country based on different rate classes. It's harder to do the C&I, but the mass market's fairly readily, it's hard to find, but you can get it. Startup costs, headcount. So typically if you're doing a startup, you're starting with X number of bodies and you're adding them based on some kind of metrics. Supply cost is the key, which gets into the margin headroom, which is below that by each utility in that market. Per meter fees is typically associated with either a system charge or it could be utility charges, data charges. So there's always per meter fees. Systems costs, whether that's, picking a system, launch costs, so forth. And in call center, we use our own tab for that because typically there's a metric around you need, a certain base start if you're doing a startup of a certain number of people. Then there's metrics for a certain number of customers equate to additional CSRs or additional supervisors, so that call center grows with customer growth, and those metrics go hand in hand, whether that's outsourced or internal. So creating this and pulling the data to get the different cost elements, takes a good bit of time. Even if you've been to the country, this part is pretty critical because this is the money. So from that, there's a business case. It's amazing to me how many people we work with that don't want to go through with the business plan. They just say, okay, well, we kind of got it figured out. It's, we know what we're doing, done this before, but we believe in them. I believe in them personally. We put in a little table of contents here. It's basically a business plan. And then the key is when you get through the pro forma, what's the risk analysis? There's always risk. What are the key risks? Is that, we're not sure we can get the customers, or the supply cost is the headroom is hard to figure out. So you got sensitivities on low, high, etc. At some point you get to what's the investment required and what's the return on investment look like? And then what's your implementation? What's your strategy and what's your implementation? And if you're buying something, the implementation is, okay, we're going to go start shopping. Or if you're launching something, it's completely different. And then whoever's putting this together, what do you recommend is the best path? I think I see you. No, it's not a question, sorry. So before we finish the business plan and the pro forma, we do sort of 2 cuts at an implementation plan. I'll call it the business case level, and here's the elements, so that when you go through a preliminary launch plan, typically on phase 1 and 2, the pre-launch and the launch phase, not so much the testing and operational. If by doing that exercise, 99 times out of 100, it changes your business case and changes your pro forma because you had to actually think through what it's going to take to implement. So it's a little different cut at a business case based on we're going to actually implement it. So there's more elements here around, is your brand going to work? Do I have to go through a branding exercise? For example, some of the retailers we've taken to Japan, their U.S. name just doesn't work in Japan. So we've gone through a branding and naming exercise that actually got started. For the implementation, you just need to know kind of what that costs in the reality that you got to do it. Facilities. Do you need an office? Can you start with an executive center? Do you need and what are those costs? It costs a lot less, for example, to get office space in the Netherlands than it does in London or in Tokyo. So there's different costs around that. What's the accounting look like? Supply risk. Pricing and contracts, how's that going to work? So often in the competitor research, not only is it who the competitors are and what they're selling, we'll pull down their price sheets. In some cases, we'll actually dummy up and go on their websites or their call centers and go through their price plans to back into what their margins look like, so that we have a better understanding not just who the competitors are, but what are the products they're selling. And part of the strategy is, what can you do differently, or do you want to sell the same thing everybody else sells, or some of both? Setting up a call center, even if you use an outside vendor, there's time, effort, and cost. So we typically use something we call Smartsheet in a project management office to model this process. So there's templates and fairly detailed spreadsheets in two kind of phases: the pre-launch and business plan, and then when you actually launch, a lot more detailed tasks. Who's going to do the work? When's it due? What has to be done before something else can be done? So we call them dependencies. For example, you have to have this before you can have that. So if item 1 takes 2 months, you can't start item 2 for 3 months. That sort of thing. So that you have not only a task list, but a timeline and dependency list on when things have to get done. So some of the key challenge working with retailers. The top one in my mind is they measure international markets based on U.S. markets. The most common misunderstanding is headroom and supply. So there's no other market that has ERCOT PJM style ISO with hedging and fixed price this or hedging that or options for the other. Nobody else has that. So we see a lot of people coming to, whether it's a European market or a Japan market, trying to analyze headroom and supply costs based on how they know how it works here. So it's challenging to get them to understand, okay, it doesn't necessarily have to be that way somewhere else, and it can be somewhat frustrating. The rest of that is going to be somewhat similar, but even customer acquisition, and I'll use Japan as an example, door-to-door is unusual. Door-to-door is done, it's just not done like the U.S., where there are companies you can hire to go door-to-door. There you develop partnerships with companies that already have clients, and it's an upsell that they already have them, as opposed to a true door-to-door company. That's just one example. So understanding the customer acquisition models, customer care and billing, that's somewhat similar here. It's billing systems and either EDI or XML or what have you. And then other components not listed here, for example, payment processing. In the U.S., there's some amount of auto pay. There's some amount of people that pay by check if you're not in the POR market, like Texas. In other countries, like in Japan, there are no checks. Nobody even uses checks. So there they have what they call payment kiosks, where you send them a bill with a barcode, and they go down to their local 7-Eleven or post office or whatever, and they pay it what amounts to an ATM. That's about 40% of that market pays that way. So just understanding what that is and what the costs are to do that is pretty important. So the next item is interpreting and analyzing international documents. And the key here is the sentence structures. And I put in an example here. in Japan, MEDI, who's the regulator, they often use a comment, they use a phrase called they recommend that retailers do this or they recommend that. What they really are saying is it's a requirement or it's a mandate. So other countries use different phrases. So if they're read as an American, you go, okay, well, they're recommending it. Doesn't mean I have to do it. In Japan, yeah, it does. So understanding that, and you can use, for certain countries, you can use Google Translate, which gets you about, I'd call it 80% of the way there, but it doesn't fix the sentence structures. It doesn't fix the intent and the analysis around that document. The next challenge we see is getting the meaningful numbers. I've talked a little bit about that. Vendor costs, they want to get real quotes that you can count on is pretty difficult because typically, in the US it's pretty easy. If you want print vendor quote, you can call 3 of them and have quotes in less than a week because they're anxious to sell you something. Other countries, and I'll pick Japan again, they want to have a relationship. They want to know you're going to be there. So you can't get a quote on your first meeting in most cases, even your second meeting. Or they say, look, I want detailed requirements of exactly what it is you want us to quote. Well, if you're doing a startup, you may not know exactly what you want. So, in those cases, or Germany is a little different. Nordics are a little different. So trying to get those costs is a good challenge. The next challenge is the risks in the business plan. It kind of gets down to I don't care how well you plan or how many pro forma scenarios you run. There's no such thing as 100% sure bet. This can't lose. So defining what the risks are, and in many cases also defining how you're going to mitigate the risks, is just as important as the plan itself. Because if you don't believe in it, then you shouldn't do it. And then the last one we see is working with what I call the perfectionist. They want the perfect plan. They want more detail. They want, you get that level of detail. No, I need more detail. At some point, you just have to accept that there's no such thing as perfect. So, and you're just not going to know as much as you want to know until you actually launch. Cause once you get started, there's always something you didn't plan on, just inevitable. So as you go down the path, how do you manage all this cost? So we use a stage gate method, whether you do it yourself or you hire people, and you come back to your budget before you start the preliminary budget. So we tie the budgets to stage gates. So you may do some initial research, do it yourself, buy a report, whatever, and you may say, okay, maybe that costs X amount of money in a certain amount of time. And you do that preliminary look and you go, this isn't for us. You can stop there. It's pretty cheap. But you say, okay, we're going to do enough research to narrow it down to our 2 or 3 markets. We're going to build our criteria list. We're going to have a pretty good idea this is something we want to do. That's the next stage gate where you go back to owners or whomever and say, okay, we think these 2 countries are viable, or even just one. This is the one we believe. Now you're doing your research, preliminary research, which is required to do the shortlist review. At some point you say, okay, I'm going to need a budget to go to the country. So, whether you go on your own or whether you get help, there's a certain cost to that. And it's pretty much then you're also doing the deep research and coming up with a strategy. So all this can be done to decide. You can stop spending at any step along the way and decide whether to keep going or not, because the deeper you go, of course, the more it costs. But when you get back from the country, you've done your deeper research, you kind of have a preliminary, maybe it's a report internally or however you want to do it. We would now want to spend the money to go seriously into the pro formas and build the business case and go through a launch plan. So this bottom 4 chevrons, that's quite a bit more time and quite a bit more money. To give you some sense, we've done step 1 through approval about as fast as it realistically should go is 3 or 4 months. We've seen it take longer. Depends on internal commitment. We've had people say, okay, I went, I looked, I want to go, and it was like 6 weeks. Our view is you haven't done enough homework yet to actually know. So part of our pricing is, we base it on stage gates so that at any point people can stop. And this is all the research part. Once you get approval, actual launching and going to a country is a whole nother presentation, a whole nother discussion. So this is really around exploring as opposed to launching. So that's pretty much the steps. I know I promised I would do this in 45 or less because people have time and it's precious. So this gives me, can't see the question came in. So what countries do your clients experience the highest success rate? Lowest success means operating in a country for more than a year. Let me read the rest of it. Your clients typically pull out of the market after a few years. Great question. The success rate, we've seen the highest UK, but that's only recently because the rules changed. There's good opportunities in UK. The Netherlands is pretty good market. Nordics can be done at a fairly low cost. There's a lot of switching already happened, but our view on the Nordics, it's if we can develop some kind of new value proposition for customers, a lot of them have been with their supplier for 4, 5, 6, 7 years. So I think there's opportunities there if there can be a unique strategy. Probably the hottest market in the world right now is Japan, because it's all new. That market's been open literally 2 years, 2 years April. The switch rates are high. We're seeing on average month for the last 12 months, 300,000 customers a month switching away from their utility. So that's a lot of customers switching. The rules are similar to Texas, where the retailer does the billing and collect the utility charges. So the relationship's definitely with the retailer, not still with the utility like the POR markets. So far in Japan, we haven't seen anybody pull out. We've taken 7 companies to Japan now. It takes longer to get established in Japan than, say, UK. And it costs more to go to Japan than the UK, simply because it's just a different market, different criteria. Some of the newer markets, like, well, not necessarily newer, Italy, Portugal, I can't say that I'm not wound up about it. But as far as high success rates, currently I would say, measuring the last 18 months, I would say Japan. And it's got the highest upside because certainly there's just so many customers. Plus, in 2 years, the price to beat goes away. So then it's wide open. Now, Japan's challenging because they don't have, you can get all the supply you want, so the supply is not an issue, but they don't have hedging yet. The forward markets are very immature, so offering 1-year fixed price and some of the standard products you see in the U.S. are, it's still really hard to hedge that. We're just starting to see those transactions in the last 3 or 4 months. There'll be a futures market come fall. So the ability to offer different hedge products is still ahead of us, but that's coming. As far as companies going and leaving, what we've only seen that really twice. They didn't really leave. What they did was they sold it. So they got to a certain stage, and they said, okay, I've gotten this far. I either financially can't go further, or, it's just not something you want to continue to do. So typically they sell them as opposed to just fold them. So usually it's after, well, the first one we did was about 2 years into it, and the other one was more like 4 years, where they built a business. The other challenge that we didn't really talk about is credit. Credit sleeves are pretty common in Europe, just like they are in the U.S. In Japan, they've just figured out how to do credit sleeves, so now you can get them. A year ago, you couldn't. And for most retailers, credit sleeves are pretty important. But there's only 2 sources of those in Japan. In the UK, there's pretty much the same gamut of options you have in the US. So hopefully that answers the question. I think we've hit just about our time limit. So we're going to email these to you. So everybody will get an email of this. Feel free to email me or call me directly with any specific questions on any particular market. Happy to do that. Of course, love to work with you on whatever phase of planning or research that you're looking for. Partly I would do these, of course. So with that, I don't see any more questions. And thank you, everybody, for coming. Appreciate it.